The discoveries in Plainfield, Wisconsin shocked America to its core. Body parts found in a home. Human trophies displayed like sickening artifacts. But beneath the horror lay an even more disturbing question. After the shocking discoveries in Plainfield, one question remained. How would justice handle Ed Gein? A man whose mind had clearly broken in ways most couldn't comprehend. A case that would test America's legal system like no other. This is the story of a trial that would change how America views mental illness and criminal responsibility. A legal proceeding that would set precedents for decades to come, forcing judges, lawyers, and society to confront an uncomfortable truth. What happens when the criminal justice system meets severe mental illness? Today, we dig into the legal end of America's most disturbing case and discover how one judge's decision reshaped justice itself. But getting Ed Gein to trial wouldn't be simple. In 1957, just months after his arrest, the legal system faced an unprecedented challenge. How do you prosecute someone when the very question of their mental competence hangs in the balance? The first attempt to bring Gein to trial ended before it began. Mental incompetence. That's when the law recognizes the mind is too broken for justice. A judge ruled that Gein couldn't participate in his own defense, couldn't understand the charges, couldn't work with lawyers. His schizophrenia had rendered him legally incompetent. So began the decade wait, 11 years of legal limbo. Why so long? Because you can't try someone who doesn't understand they're on trial. But you also can't leave a dangerous person unprocessed forever. The system had to find a way forward. Finally, in 1968, the state of Wisconsin was ready to try Gein again. This time, with Judge Robert Golmar presiding, they would attempt what had been impossible a decade earlier. A trial that would directly confront the question of mental illness and criminal responsibility in a way that would echo through American jurisprudence for generations to come. When Ed Gein finally faced trial in 1968, the prosecution wasn't asking for just any verdict. They wanted first-degree murder for the killing of Mary Hogan. This wasn't just about punishment. This was about setting a legal precedent that would echo through America's courts for decades. Why first-degree murder in 1968? It mattered because this charge required proving premeditation and deliberation. If successful, the prosecution would establish that even severely mentally ill defendants could be held fully accountable for calculated crimes. But the defense argued that Gein's schizophrenia meant he couldn't form the intent required for first-degree murder. The evidence that led to the courtroom was overwhelming. Gein's own confession, the body discovered on his property, the testimony that placed him at the scene. But the prosecution faced an unprecedented challenge, proving that a man found legally incompetent years earlier could suddenly be held criminally responsible for his actions. This was the legal tightrope America was learning to walk, balancing mental illness with criminal accountability. Before we examine how these horrific charges unfolded in court, if this deep-dive investigation into Ed Gein's crimes resonates with you, please like, subscribe, and share. Every view helps us reach more people who need to understand the warning signs and psychological patterns that lead to such disturbing crimes. Drop your city and viewing time in the comments. This data helps me optimize when to release similar true crime investigations so they reach maximum audiences who can benefit from understanding these cases. And if you'd like to support deeper research like this, check out Super Thanks or become a channel member. Everyone asks, what made Ed Gein this way? My new book, How Ed Gein, Mother Created a Monster, examines the religious trauma and psychological conditioning that created one of America's most disturbing killers. Exactly what Netflix didn't show you. Value $24.99, pay what you want. Click the link below to download your copy and dive deeper into the twisted psychology behind this case. The defense had one clear strategy: not guilty by reason of insanity. This was the ultimate psychological defense, arguing that Gein's severe mental illness meant he couldn't distinguish right from wrong at the time of the crime. If successful, he would be committed to a psychiatric facility rather than prison. Schizophrenia. GEIN's documented mental condition had been established years earlier. Hospital records showed hallucinations, delusions, and a complete break from reality. The defense argued that when GEIN killed Mary Hogan, he was living in a world of psychotic breaks where normal legal concepts like intent and premeditation simply didn't apply. Hallucinations, delusions, and legal responsibility. That was the defense's core argument. How could someone be held criminally responsible when their mind was literally incapable of understanding the nature of their actions? The defense built their case around expert psychiatric testimony, hospital records, and the simple question, is justice served by punishing someone for actions committed while in the grip of severe mental illness? Prosecution versus defense. Two very different views of justice faced off in Judge Golmar's courtroom. The prosecution argued that GEIN knew exactly what he was doing when he killed Mary Hogan, that mental illness didn't erase criminal intent. The defense countered that schizophrenia had completely destroyed GEIN's ability to understand right from wrong. The burden of proving mental illness in a courtroom is enormous. Unlike physical evidence, psychological conditions exist in the mind, invisible to juries. The defense had to prove not just that GEIN was mentally ill, but that his illness was so severe it negated criminal responsibility. This required walking a tightrope between showing enough mental instability to support their case, but not so much that GEIN appeared completely untreatable. Expert testimony and psychological evaluation became the battleground. Psychiatrists took the stand, translating the complex language of mental illness into legal terms the jury could understand. They debated whether GEIN's hallucinations meant he couldn't distinguish reality from delusion, whether his delusions drove him to kill, and whether someone living in a psychotic break could truly be held accountable for murder. This was psychology meets law, with a man's fate hanging in the balance. On December 20th, 1968, Judge Robert Golmar rendered a decision that would echo through America's legal system for decades to come. After reviewing all the evidence, psychiatric evaluations, and legal arguments, the verdict was clear. Not guilty by reason of insanity. But this wasn't just about Ed GEIN. This was a historic moment that would reshape how America viewed mental illness and criminal responsibility. Why not guilty by reason of insanity meant institutionalization, not prison, became the defining question of this case. Judge Golmar's reasoning was revolutionary. If GEIN truly couldn't distinguish right from wrong due to his schizophrenia, then punishment served no purpose. Treatment was the only path forward. The court wasn't absolving GEIN of responsibility. They were recognizing that his mind was so fractured by mental illness that traditional justice couldn't apply. The legal reasoning that changed everything was based on 1968's evolving understanding of mental illness. Judge Golmar acknowledged that while GEIN had committed a horrific crime, his severe schizophrenia had created a psychological state where criminal law, as we understood it, simply couldn't reach. The judge's decision established that mental illness could completely negate criminal intent, setting a precedent that would influence insanity defenses for generations. How this verdict reflected evolving understanding of mental illness can't be overstated. Judge Golmar's ruling recognized that schizophrenia wasn't just a character flaw or moral weakness. It was a devastating mental illness that could fundamentally alter someone's relationship with reality itself. This marked a crucial shift from viewing mental illness as purely a legal technicality to understanding it as a legitimate medical condition that could impact legal culpability. The distinction between punishment and treatment had never been clearer. Society's response to GEIN would be measured not in years behind bars, but in decades of psychiatric care. Central State Hospital in Walpun, Wisconsin became Ed GEIN's permanent home, not as punishment but as treatment. This wasn't a prison with bars and cells, but a psychiatric facility designed to house Wisconsin's most dangerous mentally ill patients. For GEIN, who would spend the rest of his life here, this represented both escape from the death penalty and entry into a different kind of confinement. Secure psychiatric care versus traditional prison. There's a crucial distinction that often gets overlooked. While Central State Hospital had security measures, its primary mission was treatment, not retribution. Guards were called attendants, cells were called rooms, and the goal was stabilization and management rather than punishment. Yet, for many patients, including GEIN, this felt like another prison, one where the walls were invisible but equally insurmountable. Day-to-day life in 1960s mental health institutions was regimented, predictable, and often dehumanizing. Patients followed strict schedules, wake-up calls, medication rounds, meals, therapy sessions, and bedtime. Treatment approaches of the era were limited, primarily heavy tranquilizers, basic psychotherapy, and work therapy programs. For someone like GEIN with severe chronic schizophrenia, institutionalization meant not just medical care, but a complete surrender of personal freedom and identity. He was no longer Ed GEIN the murderer, he was patient number 7418, a case study in the intersection of mental illness and criminal justice. Model institutional resident. GEIN's behavior and care defied every expectation. Staff members were amazed by his complete transformation from the violent killer who had terrorized Wisconsin to a quiet, cooperative patient who followed every rule without question. There were no aggressive outbursts, no escape attempts, no confrontations with staff or other patients. GEIN had become the ideal psychiatric patient. Compliant, docile, and completely harmless within the institution's walls. No escape attempts, full compliance. This wasn't just good behavior, it was complete surrender. GEIN never tried to leave, never questioned his treatment, never showed any signs of the violent impulses that had led to murder. He took his medications without complaint, participated in therapy sessions, and seemed to accept his institutionalization as his new reality. Staff described him as the perfect patient, which was both a testament to his compliance and a tragic indicator of how completely schizophrenia had reshaped his personality. The schizophrenia that never improved became the defining feature of GEIN's institutional life. Despite decades of treatment, his mental illness remained constant. He continued to experience delusions, hallucinations, and disorganized thinking. How mental illness shaped his institutional life was evident in everything he did. His speech remained fragmented, his thoughts tangential, his connection to reality tenuous. The very illness that had saved him from execution now defined his existence. GEIN lived in a world of persistent psychosis, where treatment could manage symptoms but never cure the underlying condition that had made him both dangerous and, ultimately, completely dependent on institutional care. Remaining years in psychiatric care. Ed GEIN lived for nearly 2 more decades at Central State Hospital, from his trial in 1968 until his death in 1984. 16 years of institutional life, a lifetime for some, but for GEIN it was simply existence. He aged from a 34-year-old murderer to a 50-year-old man who had been defined by mental illness for so long that few remembered the person he might have been before schizophrenia consumed everything. Natural death versus execution. There's a dark irony in how GEIN's story ended. The man who had been sentenced to die for his crimes instead died peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by medical professionals rather than facing the executioner's needle. His severe mental illness had not only saved him from the death penalty, but ultimately from the violent end many expected. The final chapter of a disturbed life closed quietly on July 26, 1984. Ed GEIN passed away from natural causes at age 50, having spent more than half his adult life in psychiatric care. His death marked the end of one of America's most disturbing criminal cases, a case that had revealed the terrifying intersection of severe mental illness and violence while forcing society to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, treatment, and the thin line between sanity and madness that we still struggle to understand today. How GEIN's case influenced future insanity defense cases. The precedent set in Wisconsin's courts rippled through American jurisprudence for decades. Legal scholars point to GEIN as a watershed moment when severe mental illness met criminal law, establishing crucial distinctions about criminal responsibility that courts still reference today. The case became a cornerstone in legal education, taught in law schools as the definitive example of when mental illness so fundamentally alters reality that traditional criminal justice becomes impossible. Institutionalization versus imprisonment, a legal distinction that GEIN's case made crystal clear. The court recognized that some individuals are so profoundly affected by mental illness that they cannot be held criminally responsible, yet they remain too dangerous for society. This created the not guilty by reason of insanity pathway, a legal gray area where criminals become patients, where punishment transforms into treatment, and where the justice system admits its limitations against the complexities of the human mind. The case that taught America about mental health and justice reshaped public policy in ways that are still felt today. GEIN's trial highlighted the desperate need for mental health infrastructure, leading to increased funding for psychiatric institutions and the development of specialized forensic mental health programs. State after state revised their insanity defense laws, creating clearer standards for when mental illness negates criminal responsibility. The GEIN precedent became shorthand for courts grappling with the most difficult intersection of mental health and criminal justice. The evolution of mental health jurisprudence accelerated dramatically after GEIN. Legal scholars began distinguishing between different types and severities of mental illness, recognizing that not all psychiatric conditions create the same legal defenses. The case influenced criminal law by establishing that severe, chronic psychotic disorders like GEIN's schizophrenia could completely undermine criminal intent, while less severe conditions might only mitigate punishment. Public policy implications were enormous. States invested millions in mental health courts, forensic psychiatric facilities, and specialized treatment programs. But perhaps most importantly, GEIN's case taught America that the line between criminal and patient isn't always clear-cut, and that sometimes the most just outcome isn't punishment, but the kind of long-term psychiatric care that society owes to its most vulnerable and dangerous members. The legal end to one of America's most disturbing cases. ED GEIN's trial didn't just close a criminal proceeding, it closed a chapter in American legal history. The court found a way to balance justice with compassion, punishment with treatment, society's need for safety with its moral obligation to the mentally ill. In deciding that GEIN belonged in a psychiatric hospital rather than a prison cell, Wisconsin's court set a precedent that would echo through hundreds of similar cases across the nation. How GEIN's trial reflected society's evolving understanding of mental illness. This wasn't just about one man's fate. It was about America's growing recognition that severe mental illness creates a different kind of criminal justice reality. The case emerged during a period when psychiatry was finally gaining scientific credibility, when the public was learning that conditions like schizophrenia weren't moral failings but medical conditions requiring treatment. Judge Golmar's decision acknowledged what the medical community had been saying, that some criminals are so fundamentally disconnected from reality that traditional justice becomes not just ineffective, but unjust. Justice through treatment, not punishment. This philosophy, radical at the time, has become a cornerstone of modern mental health law. GEIN's case proved that sometimes the most just outcome isn't the harshest sentence, but the most appropriate care. His institutionalization wasn't an escape from consequences. It was the consequence. The treatment he received for 16 years was his punishment and his salvation, delivered not by a death sentence but by the recognition that his crimes stemmed from a mind that could not be held fully responsible. A case that continues to influence law and psychology today. ED GEIN's legacy lives on in every courtroom where judges must decide when mental illness negates criminal responsibility, in every psychiatric facility where dangerous patients receive treatment instead of punishment, and in every law school classroom where future lawyers learn that justice isn't always about retribution. Sometimes it's about understanding the human mind in all its complexity and tragedy. What do you think about the insanity defense? Let us know in the comments. Should severe mental illness completely absolve criminal responsibility, Or is there a middle ground between treatment and punishment? ED GEIN's case forces us to confront these impossible questions, and your perspective helps us understand how this historic case resonates with modern audiences. Subscribe for more deep-dive true crime investigations that go beyond the surface details to explore the psychology, legal precedents, and lasting impact of history's most disturbing cases. We dive deep into the evidence, the courtroom drama, and the human stories behind crimes that changed how we think about justice and mental health. Next, another case that shocked the world. Stay tuned for our next investigation into a crime that challenged everything we thought we knew about criminal psychology and legal responsibility. You'll want to be part of the conversation when we unveil this haunting tale.